Hey, it's Chris from Military Aviation History, and I'm super excited because we're going to be checking out the out and inside of this P-47D. Of course, comes courtesy of the Air Corps Aviation Group, who maintain this aircraft and have restored it, and it's absolutely beautifully maintained here. And of course also inside the cockpit, 100% community funded by the supporters, by the Patreons, by the channel members, as well as the crowdfunders. And a big thank you here also to Bob F, who is sponsoring this episode. Now, on the P-47 that we have here up front, we have a Curtiss standard propeller. That's one of the smaller propellers that we have on the P-47, which generally came with 3 different propellers, either Hamilton standards or Curtiss electric propellers. You can also tell the difference between them via that prop hub. If it's long and pointy, it's Curtiss electric. Once it's a little bit more acorn shape, it becomes a Hamilton standard. It's a constant speed propeller of 3.7 meters in diameter. Behind that, of course, you have the massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine with a turbo-supercharger mounted in the back of the aircraft. More information on that very soon. Now we're at Oshkosh here, of course, at EAA Air Venture, and yes, there's going to be engine noises, there's going to be people in the frame as well. Let's embrace aviation culture together. Now, this engine at its top output produces, and this is unbelievable in fact, there is an A-10 taking off right now, the Thunderbolt 2 taking off right now as we're filming the Thunderbolt itself, so that's pretty cool. But yes, at the top output level of this engine, we are sitting at 2,300 horsepower, which is amazing. For that output, of course, we're going to war emergency power. 2,700 RPMs with 64 inches of manifold pressure. And if we drop that down to cruise, we go all the way down to 1,600 RPMs and 42 inches of manifold pressure. Now, the intakes you see up front are for the oil coolers. 2 intakes there, and then also for the supercharger intercooler. The outlet flaps here we have is for the cylinder cooling. Air comes in the front. It's an 18-cylinder air-cooled engine and is then ejected via here. You have the oil cooler flap there as well. And then as we move towards the wing, we have a gun camera. And yes, we're going to also talk about the 50 cals in just a second on the port wing. And of course, the gear swings inside into the gear wheel, just like so. Moving then towards the trailing edge, the leading edge, we find downward identification lights right here. And of course, we have navigational lights on the wingtips as well. And then let's come towards the aileron. Large aileron here with a fixed trim tab. And then we have flaps right here, making up the rest of the trailing edge. The fuselage of the P-47 semi-monocoque, and the weight goes from, yes, 10,000 pounds empty to 19,000 pounds fully loaded, depending on what exact variant and what exact loadout we have behind us. Now, this is a Razorback P-47D. You see that because it doesn't have the bubble top canopy, and the aircraft itself. In the latter section of the fuselage here in the hull, we also find the whole turbo supercharger arrangement, as well as, of course, the intercooler. Now, the intercooler sits right about here, and the outlet flaps is here. So cold air is coming in from the front, and then it cools the air that needs to be cooled inside the engine, and then is ejected right here. The turbo supercharger sits down here. Now, there's a covering there, so you can't actually see the turbine. What it is, it has the compressor, the supercharger on top, and a turbine below that. And what happens is there is air coming from the exhausts towards this turbo supercharger arrangement, and then as it gets compressed in the turbo supercharger, it goes back via the intercooler once again on a parallel path almost towards the carburetor. Now, I would definitely recommend another channel and another video here on this whole arrangement, namely by Greg's Airplanes and Automobiles, who has gone into absolutely fantastic detail on the power arrangement in the P-47. So do check that out after this video as well. As we can come to the rear, we also find a retractable tail wheel, and then of course we'll have a look at the whole tail setup here as well. Now, I have to be a little bit careful navigating this. We find a massive elevator with a variable trim tab here as well, and also a fixed trim tab here. And then of course the rudder with a variable trim tab as well. Navigational lighting making up the rest of the arrangement. Now as we swing around towards the fuselage, of course, let me talk about some of the other systems that we have. Now with the massive engine that we have up front, you can of course anticipate that there's also going to be a lot of extra additional tanks there. So we have one oil tank, 28 gallons. We have the hydraulic reserve, that's roughly 2 gallons. We have the battery up front there as well. And then, because this engine can also feature water injection, we have a 30-gallon water tank there as well. And if that isn't enough, there is enough room there also. Then in front of the pilot, we have a fuel tank, 200 gallons, and then a 100-gallon aux tank. Yes, 100 gallons in your aux tank. Just let that sink in for a second, yeah? That's more than some bombers have, to be honest. And of course there's also firewall there, making up part of the protective arrangement in the P-47, and an additional firewall is then also mounted here in the back, protecting the pilot. And that is it. There's only 2 protective screens, armored screens, in the aircraft, and all the talk that exists about the P-47's survivability, it's not down to the armor, it's the way it is constructed. In terms of armor, it is very conventional, very generic for the time, with only those 2 armored plates. Radios make up the rest of the arrangement in the back. You also see the radio mast there, and of course there's also oxygen tanks installed. Moving along the trailing edge there, we find a variable aileron tab on the left aileron, of course navigational lights on the wingtips, a pitot tube right about here. And now let's start talking about what everybody wants to know, of course, the weapon systems of the P-47. Let's talk about the outboard and the centerline ordnance first. So you could have outboard bombs up to a single 1,000-pound bomb, and then also a centerline bomb, 500 pounds for example, could be stored there. Or you could also have drop tanks, or the centerline 75, 105, 200 gallons, something like that, and on the outboard 150, even 300 gallons there, making up additional range for the aircraft. You could also mount rockets, 10 HVAR rockets, 5 on either side, 100, that would have been quite blistering. And then of course, finally, we come to the pinnacle of the P-47, the 450 cals in the wing. That's 12.7 by 99 millimeters, and each gun has 425 rounds, and that makes up a grand total of 3,400 rounds in the aircraft. And roughly 425 or 435 rounds per gun makes up more or less 18 to 20 seconds of fire, which is more ammo capacity than most fighters at the time, and especially in the American arsenal, this was one of the best shooters that they had. That brings me to the end here with the P-47, so let's now jump inside.
It is time to jump into Bonnie and check out the cockpit. A big thank you here to the crowdfunders and channel supporters. It is only thanks to your support that this trip was possible, and of course Air Corps Aviation for this fantastic access. Their restoration and maintenance of this aircraft is superb, and they also operate a fantastic online source for pilot manuals. Check it out in the description below. In typical fashion, we will go through this clockwise. The aircraft is in immaculate flying condition and largely follows the original layout, with the obvious changes to modern flight regulations. Just to the lower 3 o'clock position of the pilot, we find the trim control wheels. The top left is for your yaw trim, then to the top right you have your roll trim, and then the vertical wheel is for your pitch trim. Notice how small indicators in the center illustrate the respective trim deflection. Obscured here behind and below the straps are the fuel tank and bomb release panel, as well as the emergency hand pump. Moving forward, we find a flap control lever, as well as a landing gear handle and a fuel tank selector. Set just above this, we find part of the controls for the engine cooling systems. To the top, horizontal installed indicator shows the oil cooler deflection, with the appropriate control for this shutter just being installed forward of this. And the same applies for the intercooler with an indicator and the respective control switch next to it. And then the red cover is for the gun and camera switch. Moving forward, we get to the controls of the Thunderbolt's powerhouse. First, somewhat hidden, the supercharger control lever. Then, the large handle is the throttle with an integrated water injection switch. Bronze knob is your push to talk button for the radio. The lever marked P is for your propeller RPM control. while the red one, of course, is your mixture control. Finally, we have the obligatory tensioning wheel mounted to the side of the quadrant. Below the quadrant, next to your left leg, we find a control panel. First up, we have the propeller control switches and its associated circuit breaker. Here you set automatic pitch control via the governor and propeller control handle, or alternatively, you can use the switch to make manual adjustments to the blade angle if you are flying in fixed pitch. Then we have control switches for an assortment of lights in and outside of the aircraft. And then we have the generator and P2 tube switch that is set right next to the emergency booster pump rheostat, as well as an ammeter. Finally, red colored circuit breakers round off this panel. Moving towards the center, let's look up first. Here we find a mirror to provide some additional rearward visibility. Then on top of the centrally mounted instruments, the reflex gun sight is sitting above the central instrument board. Right next to that is the backup sight, and this is used in conjunction with a nose-mounted front sight that you can make out through the windshield. Also notice the internally mounted armored windscreen for some protection for the pilot from lower caliber rounds. Now let's swing down to the central gauges. If you have seen my episode on the P-40, P-51 or P-36, you'll notice that the Thunderbolt has a lot more broad space for placing these dials. It follows the growing standardization of the time with the 6-pack in the center and engine dials to the right. Yet I can't help but think that, following this standard, somehow all this space could have been used to create a cleaner layout. Especially the basic 6 could have been stacked properly. But it works, and maybe that's just me. Let me know what you think. And just to alleviate any doubts, the layout you see here largely follows what you will find in the original manuals. First up here we have a contactor clock for directional finding, and then we have ignition switches, accompanied by a battery switch. Then we have the water pressure gauge for the injection system, which is found in the top left, and below that we have the fuel quantity indicators. And then we have the turbo-supercharger RPM gauge, and then we roll into the basic 6. First up we have an altimeter in feet, as well as a speedometer in miles per hour. Then we come to the turn and slip indicator, and just below this we have the hydraulic pressure indicator, and then we have a compass, as well as a fuel pressure indicator. Before we continue to the right, here we have two modern VHF radios. The space in the middle was left either empty or used for reference data. Towards the right we find the artificial horizon, and below that we have the vertical speedometer, and then for the engine the starter switch is on the top right. Below this is the suction, and then we have the carburetor temperature gauge. The RPM gauge is mounted next to a combined oil temperature, fuel and oil pressure gauge. On the final row we have the manifold pressure gauge, as well as a clock and a cylinder head temperature gauge. Finally, let's have a look at the instruments and controls mounted around the central dash. On the left we have the modern switches, for example for the primer. Then in the center, a parking brake, and to the right, the oxygen flow and capacity indicators. Offset to the right from that, the old school primer pump, as well as the push rod to operate the cowl flaps. And then we also have the recognition light switches. Shifting from the center to the right, we find the oxygen regulator. Behind the tube, we have the transmitter control panel, and then the radio filter for ground-to-air communications with integrated radio tone signals for navigation. If set to range or both, singular acoustic tones in Morse code are automatically transmitted to the pilot, providing him with a guidance whether to stay on course or to steer to the left or right for a specific direction. Then we have radio sets that are mounted next to this, as well as a cockpit ventilation push rod to the lower right, which is also where you'll find the tail wheel lock. And finally we'll have a map and flight record case that rounds off this area. But we are certainly not done yet. To the immediate right of the pilot we find a oxygen mask connector, as well as the IFF radio detonator push buttons to destroy the IFF set in case the aircraft is downed in enemy territory. And right next to this we have the IFF radio switch, as well as the radio control box itself. Before we shift to the center, let's have a look here at the pilot's seat, as well as the armored plate behind it, and of course the Razorback canopy layout. As a P-47D-23, Bonnie falls outside the bubble top production order that started with the D-25. We are nearly done. Now let's swing back towards the center. We of course have the rudder pedals for yaw control, and then we also have the tow threads that can be used as a brake next to the green pistons. Then the flight stick giving you pitch and roll control. On top you have the bomb and rocket release, and then in the conventional position, the trigger for your 850s and the gun camera. Now it is your turn. What did you think of the P-47, this tour, as well as the cockpit? Let me know your thoughts about this American powerhouse in the comments. A big thank you goes out to the folks at Aircore Aviation in Bemidji, Minnesota, for giving me access to their P-47. Bonnie was a true showstopper at Oshkosh 2023, and they had a very busy schedule. So I appreciated immensely that they gave us this fantastic access and supported the filming where they could. As always, please also thank the host in the comments and check out the links in the description. The Inside the Cockpit series is 100% community funded, and we have a lot of upcoming trips planned. These depend on your support. If you like this content, sign up via Patreon or channel memberships, or donate via PayPal. All the links are in the description below, and you'll also earn some exclusive bonus as a thank you on Patreon and via channel memberships. Also, yearly subscriptions via Patreon have a 15% discount, so be sure to check that out.